Passamos então à nossa sessão. Gostava de dar as boas-vindas a 3 pessoas que representam 3 instituições que têm tornado tudo isto possível. Adicionalmente à Ana Free, que se sentou aqui ao meu lado, tenho ao meu lado 3 personalidades bastante relevantes neste contexto. Richard Allan, do Facebook, enquanto rede social, Brian Levy, da HP, que representa tudo o que são as infraestruturas, comunicações, etc., e o Pedro Bidarra, da BBDO, que tem apoiado as organizações, tudo o que diz respeito a comunicação, marca, etc. Cada um destes convidados irá partilhar connosco as suas experiências e, no final, teremos algum tempo para debate, não vai ser muito, e pretendo também abrir, naturalmente, no fim, a uma ou 2 questões à audiência. Uma nota que eu vou tentar ser rigoroso no cumprimento dos horários, sendo que já estamos 15 minutos atrasados. Vamos tentar recuperar, se assim naturalmente for possível. E gostava, ainda antes de enquadrar esta sessão, de fazer 2 questões à audiência muito rápidas. Gostava de saber quem é que aqui nunca visitou a página do YouTube. Eu gostava de saber quem é que aqui recebeu menos de 5 convites para o LinkedIn. Isto é a demonstração que este fórum faz de facto sentido e que estamos todos embebidos na web 2.0. Eu fui tentar, como bom consultor, não é? Fui tentar ir encontrar alguns números interessantes. O YouTube cresceu 20 milhões de unique users no primeiro semestre de 2009 e 120 milhões de unique users acederam no último mês. O Facebook, Richard, tell me if I'm wrong, tem 300 milhões de contas ativas e tem 2 bilhões de visitantes. No Twitter, são colocados 20 milhões de tweets por hora. Temos 1,4 milhões de novos posts em blogs nos Estados Unidos todos os dias. 22 dos 100 websites mais populares nos Estados Unidos são blogs. E um exemplo mais do nosso dia-a-dia, o avião que caiu no Rio Hudson, que todos sabemos, apareceu primeiro nas redes sociais antes de aparecer nos mídias tradicionais. Adicionalmente a isto, no estudo que fizemos o ano passado, TMT Predictions, da Deloitte, perguntámos aos executivos nacionais qual é que era, eu diria que o mídia que iria ter incremento de receitas e 83% referiram que seria a internet. Nesse sentido, o que pretendemos nesta sessão é que, no fim, todos os que estamos aqui presentes, eu incluído, naturalmente, tenhamos uma ideia mais clara do impacto destes modelos em nós próprios, na nossa vida, nos nossos clientes e fornecedores, em cada uma das nossas empresas e também na sociedade. Passo agora ao nosso keynote speaker, que é o ilustre Richard Allan. O Richard representa uma das redes sociais mais famosas e dinâmicas, o Facebook. Quem não conhece o Facebook? As 300 milhões de contas ativas que eu referi há pouco partilham 2 bilhões de fotografias, 14 milhões de vídeos, 3 milhões de eventos. Se isto não são números impressionantes, não sei o que é uma coisa impressionante. O Richard é Policy Director do Facebook para a União Europeia. Antes disso, foi diretor de European Government Affairs para a Cisco. Em abril de 2008, o Governo do Reino Unido nomeou Richard para presidir a uma equipa de trabalho com o objetivo de potenciar uma melhor utilização dos dados governamentais. Richard, welcome, and the stage is yours.
Thank you, Miguel. And I shall recover the clicker from here, but head back across, because I think most of you are in the centre. And thank Diogo Vasconcelos and APDC for inviting me here to talk about something that I'm really passionate about, to share my views on that with you in one of my favourite cities in the world. And as I do so, I thought it was going to be very tough to follow Anna Free this morning, because both she's a fantastic performer musically, but also I think in the comments that we heard from her, we understand that she really gets the stuff that we're doing. Having thought it'd be tough, actually, I now think that was the perfect introduction. Facebook's mission up there, which is precisely to give people the power to share things, is realized in people like Anna. The whole reason that we get up in the morning and do what we do is to create a platform that we think allows people to share things of value to them, whether that's entertainment, whether it's family connections, whether it's photos of the grandkids. That's why we're doing what we're doing. So thanks, Anna, for that superb demonstration of what we're trying to achieve. Now, we've had some figures from Miguel, and you were right. It is 300 million users was the last publicly announced figure until the next publicly announced figure. Rather than going through all of the stats, I'll just pull out a few numbers which I think are interesting. The first is that we now get 1 billion photos a month uploaded. As I'm sure Brian will testify from his position of technical expertise, that means that we do have to challenge the laws of physics. There are certain constraints about what you can do with ICT that Facebook is having to push all the time in order to be able to handle that huge quantity of data and get it to you in a reasonable period of time when you log on. The second fact I think that's very interesting about the way we've developed is that our fastest growing demographic now is 35 plus. So if there's anyone out there who thinks that Facebook is for kids and hasn't signed on, think again. Facebook is now going through waves of people joining. Recently we had a whole wave of 60 pluses. We think that was due precisely to people putting photos up of their kids when they're born and saying, hey, grandpa, grandma, if you want to see the photos of the kids, you better sign up because that's where we're sharing them. So 35 plus is growing. The other interesting fact in the light of yesterday's very interesting discussion is that 70 million of our users are now using it through mobile platforms. And the mobile users use Facebook across all channels more than average users. So mobile is not a substitution but a complement. And we're now seeing tremendous growth in that space. And Facebook, very early on, committed to using mobile because we recognize that this world of co-production, this world of people wanting to take control does mean that when they're out and about and they've got a camera, or like Diogo here with his flip video camera where he's filming us all today, if you've got a small device in your pocket, you want to share from that device to your friends, to the broader community on the internet. And the final one is this 6 billion minutes per day spent on Facebook. So 6 billion minutes is the total number of minutes spent by that community. So they're spending a considerable amount of time. I know that a lot of that is minutes that are spent at work, and some people are concerned about that. I get paid to spend all my day using Facebook at work. It's going to be very interesting as we develop. I mean, there are various studies. You get these conflicting studies, some saying, you know, it's really distracting and lowers productivity, but others that say actually happy, fulfilled workers who can keep in touch with family and friends while they're at work may actually be more productive. And I think we'd place ourselves in that latter group. We will caution, though, there are some situations where you don't want to use Facebook at work. This is a guy in the US who was, this is how you can also test if you're Facebook addicted. He was burgling somebody's house. While he was burgling their house, he saw a computer and he couldn't resist logging on to check the status updates of his friends. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, the really stupid thing that he did was not to log off again. So when the owners came back to their house and looked at the computer screen, the burglar's details were sitting there in front of them. So that's when not to use Facebook at work, but we have to say that's not a typical example of how it happens. In terms of what we're trying to do, in terms of building this platform as I would describe it for people to share, there are really three important elements. I'm going to talk mainly this morning about this first one, this question of identity, but we're also thinking about identity and then the connections to the things that are important to you. Some of those connections will be with family and friends. Some of the connections will be with entertainers and people that you enjoy. Some of them will be with brands and with products and services. But the key concept is that the user sits there in the middle and makes the connections to the things that are important to them. And that's essentially the world of social networking as we see it developing. And then finally, once you've made those connections, what do you do with them? Well, you start to share information, share content. And importantly, in the context of this morning's debate, you now have the ability to start co-producing around that content within your own community. So again, you'll see if you use YouTube, a very typical example that something is shared, and then other people share their responses to it. So if you look at some of Anna's videos, you'll see other people have done tribute videos in response. And it's that kind of dynamic cross-fertilization and sharing that we think is particularly enabled by the Web 2.0 technologies. Miguel mentioned some work I'd done with the UK government on something called the Power of Information Task Force. Within that, we tried to stimulate some public service examples of co-production. And this is really drawing on a tradition which has been going, I guess, 20, 30 years, that has been dramatically boosted by the internet, the tradition of open source software, where people do come together, typically in tightly defined technical communities, and have been able to produce some fantastic products in the technology space way before, if you like, the production of music, video, and so on started. And in fact, those tools now are the ones on which we build the platforms for the sharing of the music and so on. So we did this for the UK government with a competition called showasabeterway.co.uk. The website's still there if you want to go and have a look. And we actually had over 400 individuals or groups of people in the United Kingdom come forward and say, if you give us some data, we will mash it up together and we will produce something of genuine value to the citizens. And those range from sites like where's my nearest school, where's my nearest post office, through to my favorite, which is one called SatLav. SatLav is lavatory in English. Sat was for satellite, and the idea of this was that I should be able to go anywhere with my mobile phone, text a particular number, and be told the location of the nearest public toilet. Now, that's a very, very kind of important service to a lot of people. It's not something that the government have thought of themselves, but citizens said this is really important. And actually, if you give me the basic data, if you give me the mapping data, and you give me the location of the toilets, I can put it together, I can build that service. So we had 450 ideas of great new public services, some of which are now being developed through this co-production model. In terms of Facebook's own development, we've used this crowdsourcing, this co-production model very extensively ourselves. This is a service called Translation. So Facebook started as a US-only site, but has seen dramatic growth as we've now translated, I think, to around 70 languages. They include Pirate English, so it can say "Uar mi hearties" and various other variations of traditional English. We now have it in Latin. We have it in a whole load of languages that people have just invented, but most importantly, we have it in 70 widely used languages. And when recently in Iran we had the scandal of the elections taking place and the protests against that, some people decided they wanted to translate Facebook into Farsi, the Iranian primary language, that it hadn't been done yet, and within a period of days they managed to translate the whole site into Farsi. The way that works is, again, a classic co-production crowdsourcing model where all the content on the site is available for translation, users translate it themselves, and then other users vote on whether that translation is accurate or needs to be changed. So that's how Facebook has translated itself, but we've now made those tools available for any website out there who want to connect to Facebook and use the same translation tool, which we think will produce a massive boost and benefit, particularly to businesses in places like Europe, where you may develop a very, very good service in a country like Portugal. You want to spread it to the rest of the European Union, but the translation costs are prohibited for a small business. What you can now do is plug into this translation service and use the crowdsourced community, the people who love your application, who are sitting there in London using it and saying, I wish it was in English, or sitting in Berlin saying, I wish it was in German. They can now be part of the co-production and translate your web service into their language. The other thing that people have done on Facebook is use it to, if you like, co-produce their own political protest. This was one that was by the Colombian community and the Colombian expat community against the FARC, a terrorist group in Colombia. They managed to bring together 500,000 people, and from their organization managed to create some very powerful and effective demonstrations. We see this ourselves in Facebook. If we do anything, we've given our users the tools to organize against us. And I noticed there's one group that's been created recently which says, I am against any changes that Facebook makes, whatever they are, to the site. And most Facebook employees have now joined the group. But if we do anything, our users will organize, and literally millions of people can come together very, very quickly. Sometimes, I think, for very powerful and politically effective causes like this, sometimes for more trivial ones. And then we have major celebrities, again, organizing in the same way. So that Obama has, I think, around 7 million supporters in his network. Michael Jackson has more, but he has done very well, and some political figures are using it very effectively. Now, I said one of the key elements to do with this is this question of identity. Back in 1993, there was a very famous New Yorker cartoon which said, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And somebody has created this photo, which I've taken from Flickr, a wonderful photo sharing site, which actually sort of tries to symbolize that concept. And it was true. In the early days of the internet, anonymity was king. That's what we wanted. We went on the internet to be anonymous. Nobody knew if we were a dog. Nobody knew who we were behind the scenes. This is a challenge that was put to me by a 13-year-old, and kids often have the best comments when it comes to talking about the future. A 13-year-old said in a session I was in, I wish that you knew who is talking to you and that they are who they say you are when you're on the internet, which to me symbolized how things have changed over time. And it doesn't mean there's not a role for the anonymous internet. Probably all of us in this room want to be anonymous sometimes, but what has grown is the desire to be identified on the internet, the value that is seen in being identified, the value of going into communities where you take an identity with you and where you do know who people are when you talk to them, when you discuss with them. When you go onto a gaming site now and you're joining a game with a group of people online, it's actually quite frustrating not to know anything more about the people you're gaming with once you've created that connection, that relationship with them. And so what we're doing is creating some tools that allow people to have an identity which they can take across the internet, where they can express themselves, where in a sense everyone can control their own identity, can share that, and can use that in the variety of social contexts where that's important. And I say that not to say that the anonymous side isn't important, but to say that the anonymous side is no longer enough, considering how important the internet is to our lives. And I think that this carrying of identity is actually critical to the way that we're going to develop in future and the way that we're able to come together and organize with these real identities rather than this anonymous mush. And anyone who's run a blog, who's run a website where they allow anonymous commenting, I think will understand why there are some challenges around that and why very, very quickly, for every successful Wikipedia where people come and behave in a responsible way, there are many other examples where things start to fall apart simply because people don't have that coherent sense of community and responsibility. So what we're doing to make that happen is to allow people to carry the identity they've created within the social network to a number of different places on the web and to make those co-production zones. So we've done it on things like MTV Music Awards, we've done it with some brands, we've done it with things like CNN, where when CNN broadcast the Obama inauguration, they used a little technical widget to allow people to make their comments alongside that with their Facebook identities, so that we had people engaging in that event using their real identities rather than simply the old anonymous commenting model. We're increasingly starting to do it on devices as well, and I mentioned earlier the fact that devices are very important. We've got some integration into things like the Nintendo DS so that you can upload photos, and just this week we announced the integration. It's just been launched into Xbox 360. And again, you think of it from the position of a parent where your child is going online and using something like Xbox 360. Today, they do that and they make friends with people and they game in a very social environment, again, with no additional identity or context. Increasingly, they'll be able to choose, if they want to game with people for whom they have that additional identity and context. We think that's quite a dramatic transition, simply because it will unlock the potential to do far more. When you work in the anonymous environment, life feels a lot riskier and therefore you do less. When you're working in an identity environment, you actually feel much more confident to do more sharing, to do more engaging, to do more co-production. In order to make all of this happen, though, we've recognized, and Miguel, I think, referenced this in the introduction, that there are some very significant issues around privacy. We're all naturally sensitive, and my background as a politician was to spend a lot of time actually being very hostile towards things that the UK government was proposing in terms of requiring people to use very hard, solid technical identity systems for various transactions. We're sensitive to that, and we recognize that in order for people to, again, to feel confident, they have to feel that they're in control of their information. When you put the information on the web, the last thing you want to think is that that information will be used in ways that were unexpected. And so what we've done is to try and develop a privacy policy that explains things in clear language. And I don't know how many people in the audience are lawyers, but they will recognize that there's always a tension. You have lawyers saying, look, you've got to put all of this stuff in your privacy policy, because if you don't, then we could be sued. And you've got regulators saying, we want the privacy policy to be really clear, simple language. And those two are often incompatible. So we spend a lot of time struggling with getting that right, with giving people the intelligible tools that they need so they can control this information on the internet, and at the same time, not making things too complex or too risky from our point of view. And we just recently relaunched the privacy policy. I think it's going up actually today. And we did that by consulting with our users. We published something. We co-produced with our users. We said, this is how we think the site should work. We knew that if we just published something and didn't consult our users, they would organize anyway and say, whatever change you make, we don't like it. But what we did was to engage with our users and try and have a co-production relationship with them rather than simply give them a finished product. And we think that's been very successful.
You have about 5 minutes, okay?
Thank you. And I only have 2 slides, so that's perfect. In terms of the models that we think are interesting for people to look at for future development, the Huffington Post is one we'd point to. Again, Miguel referred to the changes in business models that are occurring over time. The Huffington Post is cited as one of those sites which is challenging traditional media. It started as a blog, but it's a blog that's kind of grown up so that it now has some traditional blogging-type contributors, but also some paid journalists, and represents in the media space, in the US at least, quite a serious challenge to traditional media models and media ownership. And what they've done recently is to implement a connection to Facebook so that people now engage with Huffington Post using their Facebook identities. And what they've seen is, I think, a greater than 300% increase in referrals from the site, because now what's happening is, if people see an article of interest on Huffington Post, each person who sees that shares that with their friends. And typically people on Facebook have 130 friends, so each time an article is viewed, somebody is sharing it with 130-odd people who probably have got similar interests because they're the friends of the person who's sharing the article. And so they're seeing this massive increase in the distribution of their content through social networking. And we think that's going to be one of the major impacts that we have. That if you've got a good piece of content, and again, coming back to Anna's example, the best way to get your content out there is for 1 million people to share it with 100 people each. And then you're starting to reach massive, massive audiences. And they've also seen this phenomenon of the commenting and the way that people behave changing, so that a significant number of their comments now on the site, a significant amount of the new content is coming from Facebook users who go back to comment. And the way that they behave, because they're taking their Facebook identity with them, because their comment is going to be shared with their friends, is really quite different from the way that people behaved previously, where they could simply go on there and put up whatever they liked. So they're seeing an increase both in quality and quantity of traffic to the site. So that kind of connection between a brand, an outlet, a content producer, and a community like the Facebook community, we think is very significant in terms of developing the new business model. And finally, I thought we'd better revise that Facebook vision of identity connection and sharing, really in the light of this morning's commentary and this morning's discussion. It really is about everybody on the net having an identity like Diogo's identity here that they can put forward and use to share with their friends. And it really is about connecting with the things that you enjoy, like connecting with Anna across the net. I say that's why we get up in the morning, to create that platform to enable this kind of sharing to take place. We think it has significant positive benefits for users of the internet. It really is an Internet 2.0 that we're starting to develop with the social web. And I look forward to the questions and discussions later on. Thank you very much.